All right, so the first time I ever visited St. Louis was actually not when I took the job here at Messiah, but it was actually back in 2011. That was my first time here in the area. And during that trip, I was lucky enough to go see a Cardinals game. And I say lucky because most of you here know that 2011, that was one of the great eras to watch Cardinals baseball, wasn't it? That was obviously a World Series season. But beyond that, I mean, this was the era of Albert Pujols, Matt Holliday, Yadier Molina. I mean, I wasn't even a Cardinals fan back then, but I knew who these guys were. So it was super cool to get to be here in high school and get to watch them play. But I will say that there was one era of St. Louis sports that I wish I had been here for. And that was the Kurt Warner, Torrey Holt, Isaac Bruce, and Marshall Faulk era. Put them up on the screen. Now, that was supposed to be here with me, but my wife and I changed cars this morning, so the box itself is empty. I did that thing last night where I was like, I don't want to forget it, so I'm going to put it in my car, and then we traded cars, and it still didn't end up here. But yes, I'm talking about that era that people once called the greatest show on turf. And I still remember playing Madden 02 back on PlayStation 1, if you can believe it. Back when the graphics, back when the graphics looked like this. Not too bad for 2002, by the way. But in that game, the Rams, they were just so much fun to play because they had the best offense in the game, okay? And so when I saw that Marshall Faulk bobblehead at Goodwill, what I saw was a local legend from this city who came from this past era of greatness. An era that is now a story that St. Louis families tell their kids about, right? Let me tell you about the days of the greatest show on turf. The days when we were Super Bowl champions in this city. If you've been born into a St. Louis family, maybe that's a story you're going to tell your kids. If you've been born into a Jewish family back during the time of Jesus, your parents would have told you all about the era of Moses and the Exodus. Moses, you got to see, he was the hero of all heroes for the Jews. Moses, this was the guy who confronted the Pharaoh of Egypt, right? The most powerful king of his day. He was the one who led God's people out of slavery and into the promised land. He was the one who parted the waters of the Red Sea. He was the one who God gave the 10 Commandments to. And because of all this, the Jewish people held Moses in the highest regard. He was the faith celebrity of all celebrities. And in Jesus' day, the Pharisees themselves, they were quoted as saying, "We are followers of Moses." The point is, Moses was the greatest of faithful figures back in Jesus' day. He was the standard of what a person of faith should look like. So who do you look up to? Who are your heroes? You know, it's funny, the thing about heroes is that over time, the mythology about them grows. And it can grow to the point where these people come off as basically perfect individuals. I'll give you an example. Take George Washington. There's this myth that I grew up hearing that George Washington couldn't tell a lie. You ever hear that story? The story goes like this. George Washington, when he was a boy, was given an axe. And he goes outside and he uses that axe on a cherry tree that he's not supposed to cut down. And his dad finds out about it and he asks him, "George, did you did you cut the cherry tree? And George Washington says, I cannot tell a lie. I cut the tree with my hatchet. And I still remember as a kid, I believed this story for a little bit, and I thought, oh, cool, George Washington, good guy. Couldn't lie, apparently. Wow, what a skill. Over time, heroes, they can become more perfect than they actually were. And faith heroes can be the same way. When we look at the faithful people from the past, we tend to focus on their highlights. We focus on their best moments. And if all we know about someone is them at their best, then that sets this impossible standard for us. We assume that the people we treasure and the people we look up to were always perfect. So what about Moses? What about this pinnacle of faithful Old Testament heroes? What was his life like? Because as big a deal as he was, he had to have been a great man. He must have been strong. He must have been courageous. He must have been some great charismatic leader to be called by God to do such great things. Well, you know what's funny is the first thing we learn about Moses, let's get into his story. The first thing we learn about Moses is that he's an orphan. Moses was born during the time period where the Israelites had been enslaved by the Egyptians for 400 years. And because of this, his mother was forced to give him up as a baby. And Moses ends up being raised up in Pharaoh's household, believe it or not, in the household of the king of Egypt. And as Pharaoh grows up, as Moses grows up, he learns that he's not actually an Egyptian prince, but he's actually a Hebrew, an Israelite. He's part of the people of God. Now, Moses' story, when you look at Exodus, it begins in Exodus 2, verse 1. Just 11 verses later, the very next thing we learn about Moses is this. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses was an orphan, and Moses was a murderer. And after Pharaoh learns about this murder, Moses runs away to the wilderness, to an area called Midian. And he hides out there for 40 years. Now, going back to our hero story, you know, in any good story, when the hero, when the main character goes off to the wilderness, you know, that's usually an opportunity for them to get strong, to gain some kind of a skill, right? To get better for the mission that's in front of them. Take Star Wars, for example. You got Luke when he runs off to Dagobah to train with Yoda. Or you've got in the Batman trilogy, when Bruce Wayne goes off to train with the League of Shadows. We're used to these stories where the hero goes off by themselves into the wilderness, and it's time for them to train, to grow stronger, to gain some important skills for the mission ahead. And so Moses, the hero of the story, runs off and he hides in Midian for 40 years. And he spends those 40 years herding sheep and raising a family. And after 40 years, God shows up into Moses' life with a great calling to go back to the enslaved Israelites in Egypt. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now, go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. This murderer turned shepherd is called by God to confront the most powerful king of his day and to free an entire nation of people from 400 years of slavery. So surely with the calling of this magnitude over the past 40 years, Moses must have gained some special skills. If his job is to confront Pharaoh, maybe he's gained speaking skills, right? Good with words. If he's going to lead the people of Israel, maybe he's gained leadership skills in some capacity. Well, Moses talks to God about his qualifications for this great job. And here's kind of the summary of how this conversation goes. Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Later on, Moses says this. He says, "Well, what if they don't believe me or listen to me? What if they say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" At another point, Moses says, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." And finally, Moses just comes right out and says this. He says, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." The image you get of Moses is not of someone with great talent. Instead, you get an image of someone who committed great sin, who lacks confidence, who's afraid of public speaking, and who comes right out and says, "Can you please send somebody else? I don't want to do it." Here is Moses, the hero of the faith. And in his own mind, he does not think he is worthy of doing what God has called him to do. And from the outside looking in, he doesn't look all that impressive to us readers as well. What I see in Moses is not some perfect, unattainable model of faith, but I see someone who sees himself the way that many of us see ourselves. We just talked about this last week, that when we reflect on our sins and our failures, we struggle to feel worthy of anything. And when Moses looked at himself and looked at his weaknesses and his past, he said, "God, I am not the good, talented guy that you're looking for. I don't have the skills to do what you've called me to do." And in a sense, Moses is right. Because when we lean on ourselves and our own strength, what we end up finding is that we do not measure up. Our personal strength and our personal goodness are not strong enough and good enough on their own. And you know, when you get to the ministry of Jesus, you see this in the attitude of his disciples. In Luke, when Jesus first calls his disciples, he calls a man named Peter. And Peter's first response to Jesus is to say, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." You see, for so many of our biblical heroes, their calling by God begins with a sense of personal unworthiness. They don't see themselves as great people who are ready for a great mission. And looking back on Moses, he had all these reasons to justify why he wasn't good enough to do what God had called him to do. Maybe you feel that way about yourself, that I am not worthy or good enough or strong enough to be God's instrument in this world. We've heard Moses' side of the story. We've seen how he sees himself. We've heard him go on and on about his own inadequacies. But God had a lot to say to Moses in response. We don't have time to dig into everything that God said to Moses, but God's response basically comes down to one simple idea. God said, I will be with you. I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say. When it comes to the call of God, it is not about your own strength or your own abilities or your past. It comes down to that one promise, that he will be with you. That he will give you the words to speak when you don't know what to say. That he will give you the strength when you don't feel strong enough yourself. That he will make you worthy when you don't feel worthy on your own. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul had a moment where he also struggled with his own weaknesses. And God told Paul this. He said, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. This is the message of Jesus Christ for you. That yes, on your own, you might be unworthy. Yes, on your own, you might be weak. But by his grace, your past has been redeemed. And your weaknesses are not cause for God to avoid you, but they are an opportunity for God to work through you. You see, we tell these grand stories about the faith heroes of the past, but the truth is they were human just like you and me. They had their weaknesses, they had their flaws, and yet God still used them. So what are your flaws and your weaknesses? Is there insecurity about your skills or your abilities? Is there something you've been struggling with? Is there pain from your past? Moses had all of this, and yet he became one of God's greatest instruments. So please, never underestimate what God is able to do through you. Never underestimate his power to redeem and restore you. And never forget the promise of his presence with you. The very last thing. Well, I'll say this. God told Moses, he said, I will be with you. And you know what? The very last thing that the Son of God said to his church in the book of Matthew, he said the same thing. The last thing Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew is that same promise that God gave to Moses, that surely I am with you always, even to the end of the age. You know, you've probably experienced moments in your life where you felt like you couldn't do something on your own. I remember as a kid going up to the zip line at camp. I mean, I did not like heights back then. I don't really like them now. And so zip lines, roller coasters, things like that, they were not for me. But guess what? Every year I'd go to camp, and every year they're like, every one of you is going to the zip line, and I did not want to do it. I hated it. But something about the fact of going up there with my friends and going up there with my dad gave me the strength to do what I didn't feel I had the strength to do on my own. This is the promise that God gave to Moses and that Jesus gives to us. That God calls people into things that they might feel unequipped for. He may call you into an area that you feel you are weak in, and yet the promise is there. That in those areas where he calls us, he himself walks with us. He himself gives us the strength to do what needs to be done. He himself redeems our past from all that makes us feel unworthy. But you have to believe in his mighty power. You have to cling to his word and to his saving grace. Because when you cling to yourself and you cling to your own power, that is when your weaknesses remain weaknesses. It is not by your power and not by your might, but by his Spirit that you are used as a vessel of God. And while the heroes of old, like Moses, might be imperfect, we follow the one who was perfect. Jesus Christ, the one whose righteousness and goodness, guess what, have been credited to you and me. The perfect one has now given the power of that perfection and goodness to you. And so for those of you who are like Moses, those of you with a past, those of you who feel inadequate, my encouragement to you would be to pray. Because prayer is the ultimate form of trust. It's the place where we submit ourselves to God as we are with all of our weaknesses and all of our flaws. And we say, Lord, here I am. You know me. You know where I'm struggling. You know my inadequacies. And you know what lies before me. Would you give me strength that is greater than my own? Would you form me in ways that I can't form myself? That's what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. The Christian life, it's not a boastful life. It's not a life where we take pride in ourselves and our own perfection and what we've done. And it's not a self-propelled life where we move forward by the strength of our own effort. No, the Christian life is a life of trust. Trust that Jesus Christ can and has redeemed all that is broken and weak within you. Trusting that you are not too far gone to be used by the Son of God. That's the good news. Amen.